Welcome everybody, good afternoon. Sorry for the technical delay, it's part of the game as you know.
As always.
Today we are welcoming Dr. Lee Van from University of Cambridge. I'm honored that Lee accepted this keynote lecture that we have been talking for a while about, to come to Amsterdam and give us some details about his research. So let me introduce him a little bit. Today he will talk about sustainable travel. And this topic, of course, promises a fresh look into what we are doing in our cities, mobility choices. And in our group, of course, we have very interesting mobility studies that overlap with what Lee does. And that's why I thought that it would be a perfect moment to have a nice discussion. So we invited Luca Bertolini to be the discussant of this event. Thank you, Luca, for accepting this. Dr. Van is an associate professor in urban planning and development at University of Cambridge, Department of Land Economy. He serves as the director for the MPhil in Planning, Growth and Regeneration, and is a fellow of Gonville and Caius College. His interdisciplinary research bridges urban planning, transport studies, and spatial economics with strong emphasis on policy relevance, because Lee also does some interesting practice work related to his research. His recent work delves into strategic planning at city and regional levels, the impacts of flexible working arrangements, micromobility, and the adoption of electric vehicles. And notably, Lee is a co-investigator of the Center for Smart Infrastructure and Construction and the trustee of the IJUR Foundation, through which we have the opportunity to know each other. And in 2023, Lee co-authored the book Digital Twins for Smart Cities, Conceptualization, Challenges and Practices. We are going to have a full-day workshop tomorrow to cover topics of digital governance, with, of course, Lee's contributions as well. And he provides conceptual clarity, practical guidance for supporting city-scale digital twin development, outlining challenges, showcasing real-life practices globally. And of course, in Amsterdam, we have been looking for clues of digital twins, and we found some interesting insights with his contributions. So Lee, warm welcome to Amsterdam. Warm welcome indeed with this beautiful weather. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Julie. Thank you. I realize it's a very, very big room, so I just want to first check. David, can you hear me well from the back?
Yeah.
Very good. So for those who sit in the back, if you can't hear me,
Come closer. Can we perhaps close that?
Of course.
Oh yeah. Let me handle that.
For the record, that's a very long introduction text. I didn't write that for Tuna. Tuna is very kind and offered that very detailed introduction. In addition to that, I think it would be useful if I introduce myself a bit more in relation to this topic. I'm an architect by education, so I'm not from conventional transport planning background. But how did I get into the transport planning world? It started from my PhD. I did a PhD in sort of spatial economic modeling of the urban land use and transport systems, largely applying urban and regional economics. That's where my interest in transport started. Since last year, I've been working on a national research project funded by the UK Department for Transport and the UKI, UK Research and Innovation. It's a £10 million major investment by the government, and our primary goal or objective is to advise the UK Department for Transport on transport decarbonisation and climate adaptation. It is a research consortium that involves 13 universities in the UK. Surprisingly, I'm one of the very, very few social scientists in the team. The whole centre was dominated, still dominated by engineers. So for me, it's also sort of a trailblazing journey. I try to understand and work very productively with engineers, but also trying to convince them that policy matters, narrative matters. But in this process, of course, I have to speak their language rather than the social science language, otherwise they wouldn't follow. So this is a journey which I want to share with you. This is still work in progress, but I do hope that this will be a nice sounding board for me to make further progress. I want to talk about sustainable travel today and focus particularly on the lifestyle and the geographic perspective. I will start by introducing why I want to focus on these two perspectives. Then I will delve each one of those, lifestyle and then the geography, and with a synthesis as the conclusion. So why the lifestyle and the geographic perspective matters. First is because of a matter of urgency. If we look at this graph on the right, this shows that since 1990, how much greenhouse gas emissions reduction has been achieved by a very broad sector in the UK. Energy supply, quite impressive, down by over 60%. It was largely due to a shift from coal being the primary source of energy to renewables and nuclear. If we look across these 5 major sectors, transport stands out as the only sector that can only achieve the single-digit reduction over the course of nearly 30 years. What is more alarming is that now transport is the highest emitting sector in the UK. It accounts for about 27% of the overall territorial greenhouse gas emissions. So there is a rising urgency that we have to do something about transport emissions. However, the problem with transport, particularly for those who work in transport, they often argue that transport is different. It's different from the energy sector, from housing, from business. Yes, transport is subject to very significant income effects. For example, as the income increases, the GDP per capita increases, people consume more, people travel more. They use much more carbon-intensive modes of travel, like aeroplane. However, I think what is fundamentally worrying, alarming, is actually this quote from Rachel and Weber talking about wicked problems in planning. So I guess the fundamental problem for transport not achieving much in terms of the greenhouse gas emission reduction is because of the predict and provide model. So for so long, the whole transport planning has been driven by meeting increasing demand. Why is that? It's because we define the problems by the solution. The solution is to increasing our capacity, meeting growing demand, and hence the problem is always about measuring demand. So this is obviously sort of a methodological flaw, and this is something that I want to challenge in this project. And another reason that I think these two perspectives, the lifestyle and the geography, matter much is because even we look at some micro-interventions, completely sensible micro-interventions. This is the low traffic neighborhoods in the UK. Initially introduced as the emergency response to the COVID-19 pandemics, basically putting bollards or these barriers on side streets to basically temporarily pedestrianize the streets. And you see massive protest against these micro-interventions. And you probably have heard of this conspiracy theories about Oxford, for example, right? So the low traffic neighborhoods as a way for the government to control people, lock people in their own district, limiting social mobility. So how does this very small scale, very goodwill initiatives turn out so badly? So when I started the project, the original expectation from the Department for Transport and also the colleagues from more traditional transport engineering field is that we just look at the existing inventory of policies, national policies, and see which one will be more effective in terms of reducing the transport emissions. But I made the argument is that how can we think about interventions without understanding people and places? I'm trying to convince my colleagues that this is the precondition, this is the prerequisite for us to think about effective interventions. Okay, so let's talk about people first, hence the lifestyles. Are you a sustainable traveler? Sorry, I throw out this very provocative question to you, but if you think you are a sustainable traveler, can you put your hands up? But this is Netherlands. Right, I'm very pleased to see that. I hope that after this presentation, you'll see more nuances in addressing this question. Why I raise this question? Because when I asked this question, or when we were asked this question by the UK Department for Transport, we also think about overall emissions, aggregate overall emissions. But this is the rebuttal I can provide you. I selected 4 samples from the English National Travel Survey data. These 4 individuals, within that survey week, had a very similar level of greenhouse gas emissions from transport, ranging from about 260 to 330 kilograms CO2 equivalent. So they have a similar level of transport emissions. However, if you look at intra-week distribution, so the emissions by day, you'll see they show very distinct patterns. So for the individual one, I call it same day, every day. So it's a very consistent travel pattern, very similar level of emissions across 5 days of the week. Sample 2, 4-day working. As you can see that from Monday to Thursday, high emissions, but almost 0 on Friday. Sample 3, happy weekend. Very, very low emissions on work days, but quite high emissions on weekends. And sample 4, that is me. Well, it was not me, but I think it's a very good representation of me. Today is Tuesday, I believe. So Monday, I took the flight from Luton to Amsterdam. Yeah. So how much carbon I have generated? It's a distance of about 350 kilometers. The carbon footprint of that journey is 130 kilograms CO2 equivalent. And shamefully, I took a taxi from Cambridge to the airport. Add up. All right? So that's me. But for the following days, I will be walking and cycling. So basically, very low carbon emissions. So these 4 individuals have a similar level of emissions, but that the intra-week distribution varies significantly. Should we consider this in designing policy interventions? So this is my experiment. Right? I want to measure this and show the importance of thinking about this intra-week variability in promoting sustainable transport. First of all, I think about measurement, how we measure this variability. This is the coefficient of variation. So it's the standard deviation divided by the mean. It's a standardized measure so that we can compare groups of very distinct level of emissions. Just to pique your interest on this, I want to raise another question. If we think about this variability, intra-week variability of travel, I want you to compare this variability across different socio-economic groups. So here we follow the UK National Statistics socio-economic classification. So there are 4 groups, from high to low. If we think about income, managerial, intermediate level, routine and manual occupations, and the never work. So broadly from high to low. So which group would have higher intra-week travel variability? The high socioeconomic class or the lower one?
The higher socioeconomic groups.
Higher socioeconomic have higher variability.
Yeah.
Okay. Any different views? a box plot showing you the distribution of coefficient of variation across 4 socioeconomic groups, from high to low. Surprisingly, the lower socioeconomic groups have slightly higher intra-week variability of travel. Possible reasons for this are very, very complex. Right? The one I can offer here is that because of the difference in terms of nature of work. The higher socioeconomic groups tend to have more stable work, office-based. However, for the lower socioeconomic groups, their jobs can be more precarious. They may have multiple jobs. They may have jobs without fixed workplaces. They may have a poor accessibility to public transport, leading to more variation in terms of how they travel. So this might be a surprise, but this is not the full story yet. Yeah? So let's keep this one in mind. Higher socioeconomic groups tend to have lower intra-week variability. Next question. This is about overall emissions. Overall emissions. So which groups will have higher overall emissions? The high group or low?
May I ask you, based on which, is it yearly data, all travel in a year, or just
1 week?
a
Just
random week?
just one survey week. Yeah, this is limited by the data I use. Yeah, this is national travel survey data in England. So it captures all your trips within 1 week. Now, this question, this is not about variability, but about absolute level of emission.
And it doesn't include the emissions that take place during the work time. It's only the travel.
Only transport related.
But if they work as a driver,
Yes.
transport driver. For
Yes, if you're
logistics-
Uber driver, yes, that emissions will be included.
Okay. I guess the lower,
The lower socioeconomic groups will have lower,
no, would have higher.
will have higher.
Yeah.
I would expect high income groups to have higher.
So this is the reverse. Okay. From high to low, and if you look at average, you will see that the higher socioeconomic groups tend to have higher overall emissions. If we combine these two findings, so lower variability and higher overall emissions, this leads to the stereotype about high-income people. Yeah. They emit so much, and they emit so much very consistently. However, that is actually not the truth. I want to demystify that. Yeah. This is why I show you the box plot here, rather than the average numbers, because this is exactly the case where the averages can be so misleading. This is the actual distribution of emissions. So each dot is basically an individual. Is an individual. There are actually quite lots of people. So this is basically the middle 50% of the sample. There are lots of people within the highest socioeconomic group actually have lower than the population average emissions. So there are people, perhaps some of you, are very, very sustainable in travel. And also, if you look at the lower socioeconomic groups, there are a considerable number of people who generate much higher emissions compared to their higher socioeconomic counterparts. So this is why I said, if you only look at average by socioeconomic group, it can be very, very misleading. I want to demystify that. It's not true that the highest socioeconomic groups are less sustainable. We further look into that using econometric methods to look at, for example, how emissions vary across different days of the week, across different trip purposes. So what we find is that even for those with very, very high emission, very high overall weekly emissions, they don't actually have high emissions across all days of the week. It tends to be on certain days of the week, notably on Thursday. We also find that, well, this is our inference really, because the survey data we use wouldn't be able to provide direct evidence on this. But if you go back to this, we argue that, particularly if we look at these outliers, some of those high emitters are involuntary emitters, in the sense that they don't make a voluntary choice of traveling that much or emitting that much. So this is important that we think about this voluntariness in travel choices. So if they were offered better options in terms of where they work or where they live, they may not have to emit that much. Yeah? So this is a very, very important dimension that we want to address. And our hypothesis here is that there might be a correlation between variability and voluntariness. I don't have the empirical evidence here, but this is something I want to work on. Let's carry on. Why this matters? So far I've been talking about this variability and how this varies across different socioeconomic groups. Why it matters? Because this will inform how we design policies. For those who work in the transport sector, particularly transport modeling, you will know how we segment travel demand or travelers defines how we design policies. So in the national transport model in the UK, we divide travelers into different age groups, different household types, like single person households, household with 2 children, 1 children, or 2 children more. We divide individuals by the socioeconomic classification. That's exactly the scheme I used earlier. By car ownership, sometimes by location, rural versus urban. But we don't see these dimensions appear in the segmentation scheme. So why you travel, the time of the day of the week you travel, and also the variability of your travel. So I was thinking, can we demonstrate, if we can take into account this factor, this will shed light on designing sustainable travel policies. Again, it's an experiment. So here I learned from clinical science using this latent class model. So this model is used to identify latent class or latent groups within the population. For example, for the doctors, if they want to identify the patients with diabetes, how they do that. They can only take a certain measurement. This is not something they can directly observe, hence latent. So the measurement I choose for simplicity is split. Average emissions on weekdays, average emissions on weekends, and the coefficient of variation for weekdays. So use these 3 variables around the latent class model, and I have identified 5 groups, 5 latent groups, or 5 emissions profiles. So let's look at the key characteristics of each group. Very low emission, but a very, very high variability. Average emission, medium variability. Average emission, very low variability. These 2 are super emitters. They generate much higher emissions than the population average. So this group concentrates on weekdays, and this group concentrates on weekends. They have similar level of variability. So how to demonstrate this? This is important for policy making. This is the revealing slide. So what I did is actually to look at the socioeconomic composition of each latent group. So I want to see what is the composition of population within this group in terms of their socioeconomic parameters. So again, I refer to these 4 socioeconomic classifications. So basically from high to low. Just remind you, these 2 are the super emitters. understandably, they have a slightly higher share of these highest socioeconomic groups, which is not surprising. But look at this. Again, some people in the highest socioeconomic group can be very, very successful. But also, look at those. They are perceived as low income, low socioeconomic classification, but they have very, very high emissions. So what I would argue, again, to my engineering colleagues is that if you only rely on the socioeconomic classification in your transport model, you end up designing the policies based on this classification, but this classification is not a very good indicator of actual emissions. And what is more, this is what I observed personally in Cambridge, is that if we somehow adopt these very simplistic segmentation schemes, you end up having very distracting and divisive policy narratives. Yeah, so recently Cambridge did a large public campaign for congestion charge. And the whole discussion, the whole policy debate was somehow sort of veered off from talking about the actual impact or the benefits of it. And between leading, basically it's two groups, one who live in the city, cycle every day, and those who live outside the city, they have to drive into the city every day. So this becomes a rivalry between these two groups. And to some extent, I believe that the way that we segment travelers or segment travel demand leads to these very, very divisive policy narratives. If we could have a more holistic way of segmenting travel, probably we could have a more informed policy debate. And one suggestion is that can we not focus on individuals or trips or specific modes of travel, but targeting towards the profiles, emission profiles. Of course, these profiles are latent. They are not directly observable, but using the model that I showed earlier, we can actually find empirical evidence of that. And this is the latest progress. The paper just came out. Because some colleagues argue that, it sounds quite useful to identify these latent emission profiles or identify these latent lifestyles. But how can we make sure that these lifestyles or profiles will persist into the future? They might change every day, every week. Yeah, so that we can't use that as a base for policy making. But this is a study we're basically trying to address this. This is look at the time use survey data, look at how basically the activity chain for all the individuals across 24 hours of the day. We have quite broad activity categorizations, but what is important here is that we identify archetypal lifestyles before the pandemic, that is using the data from 2015, and then we'll apply the same method to identify archetypal lifestyles during the pandemic, including the early stage of sort of post-pandemic time. What we find is that if you compare these two rows, these generic lifestyles are remarkably stable, despite this very, very disruptive pandemic. So they can survive, they can last long into the future. Right. I guess that's enough about people. We'll move to the geography.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Or is it okay to ask now or better later?
I'm happy to address any clarification questions you have.
You call for a policy that is more focused on profile,
Yeah.
but it's endogenous, right? It's like, I mean, you target a group by their profile by trying to shift them, but how do you see that happening? Because like once they're shifted, you cannot apply the same policy, right?
This is yes, I think heterogeneity is potentially an issue, but this also applies, this risk also applies to medical science, right? I mean, if you can identify your potential patients And do you take interventions whether this will change the probability or propensity of this individual having that? Yes.
Yeah, but it's not a choice to have a disease, right?
But well,
It's a choice to travel in a certain way.
I don't have that evidence. I don't have that evidence. We can argue that for the first iteration, we want to target on those high emitting profiles, or we say we're targeting on the involuntary high emitting profiles as a social priority, for example. But to what extent this endogeneity may affect the effectiveness of this, or in the future, I don't know.
Oh.
Because I have never done that experiment. Yeah, but that's a good point, yes. Okay, shall we move on to the geography? This actually is slightly simpler. I want to address two things. First is to look at how the car use pattern varies across different regions in the country. Second, I want to look at 20 years back to see that despite all the efforts that we have made in the UK, how much we have achieved. Because that actually would provide a realistic benchmark for us to look into the future. I call that a potential analysis. Okay, first thing, the car use pattern. So this is the census 2021 data covering the whole UK. Darker the color, higher percentage of car use. So potentially higher transport emissions. So it's very clear in very dense urban areas, particularly in London, very low share of car use, high share of public transport use, not surprisingly. This shows the histogram of mode share at the local authority level. As you see that the very majority of local authorities have very, very high share of car use. Oh, for some reason this is not very clear, but it's the same exercise. We'll look at the box plot. I want to look at the distribution of the the share of car use at the local authority level by region. So here you have 9 regions in England plus Scotland and Wales. So from this array of box plots, you can find 3 types of typologies. The first is London. If you look at the mean, the average is much lower than all the others. This is what you've seen basically from the map earlier. Yeah? Very, very low percentage of car use. And the second type is actually what is within this red polygon. You have very, very high average car use, but you also have outliers. So places within the region that have very, very low car use, car dependence. And these places tend to be the economic center, the core employment, the employment centers in that region. Yeah? I put down some names for you. And you see these are all basically the biggest city within that region. We have the third type, which is the Yorkshire and Humber and the Northeast. Is that for these 2 regions, we don't have any outliers. So we don't have actually that core city within this region that have very, very low car dependence. So potentially this implies a more polycentric structure, but from a transport perspective, from a sustainable transport perspective, somehow they don't have the benefits of this agglomeration. I want you to bear in mind these different typologies. Okay, I have 2 or 3 more slides showing the empirical results. I'll walk you through. This is a bit dense. Like I said, the purpose is to understand the potential for improving transport accessibility. What I did is look back 20 years. So I have the data from 2002 to all the way to 2023. I divide this 21 years into 4 periods. So 2002 to 2010, 2011, 2019, the pandemics, and the post-pandemic. What I want to find out is that how the car use has changed by period. So for each location, for each region here, you will see 3 bars. The light gray bar is the change in the 2000s. The dark gray bar is the change from the 2010s all the way to 2003. And the red bar is the cumulative effect of the whole 21 years. And because this is about car use, so a reduction of the car use will be implying a higher accessibility, so more sustainable. And if it's on that side, this is less sustainable. Okay? I will use London as the example to talk you through. So look at London boroughs here. So London has achieved quite a lot in the 2000s. We see this massive reduction of car use. But look at the impact in the 2010s, including the pandemics. It actually goes the other way, quite marginal effects. Hence the overall effects of about 6% of reduction. But we also have cases like this. So the pandemics basically exaggerate or deepen the car pandemics. What is interesting, I understand it may not be very interesting in this regional breakdown, but what is interesting is to actually look at the effects of the pandemic. Basically, the direction of change of this dark gray bar. It varies a lot. Yeah, it varies a lot. For certain locations, the pandemic actually helped to reduce the car dependence. For some other locations, it's the other direction. The same method, the same format, but this is the public transport use. Public transport use. This time, if the green bar is on this side, which means an increased share of public transport use, means more sustainable. Again, I want to focus on the pandemic impact. You first look at the gray bar. So this is the improvement or the changes from the 2000s. You see that for most of places, it's positive. But in the 2000s, most of places have witnessed an increase of public transport use. But a decade of effort has been completely reversed by the pandemic. But you see, predominantly, the dark gray bar goes that direction. So this is the damage that the pandemic has done on public transport use. Of course, we have a few outliers or exceptions, and these are probably the good cases that we need to look at, is that how in those places the pandemic has been delivering positive changes instead of negative. Okay, to summarize, so if we showing the change of these two modes on one single graph. So the green being public transport, the red being the car use. So we see more of a contrast across different places. So again, using London Borough, using London as a positive case, significant reduction of car use accompanied by increased public transport use. It's a good practice. But if you look at the northeast, it's completely different direction. Completely different direction. And remember the three patterns? So these are the regions that we see improvement in both the core and the periphery. This is a region we see improvement on the periphery, but not the core. Interesting, that's Manchester. And these are the places and regions that we see basically a deterioration in terms of transport facilities. So this is the heterogeneity we are talking about. So given this, say if we assume the whole country will achieve a 5% increase in public transport use, I don't think that scenario is realistic. So, policy implications. So we observe significant variation in terms of the past progress. And in terms of the scale of the change, it's actually quite modest. So over the past 20 years, the scale of change we're talking about, 5% increase in public transport use and 6% of reduction in terms of car use. I think this provides a very useful and realistic benchmark when we talk about future scenarios. When we think about 20% reduction of car use, what does that mean, given the past experience? And given the regional differences, we can infer that the costs for removing some of the barriers for more sustainable travel would also vary significantly. And for our project, because our project is at the national level, we face this classic dilemma: efficiency versus equity or equality. Shall we prioritize those places with very high emission intensities, or we should pursue a more coordinated approach, allowing all places to decarbonize at the same rate? That's a question I don't have any answer, but this reminds me of the carbon and Higgs efficiency. I think this is potentially applicable to this dilemma. Of course, there will be gains, both economic and environmental gains for those first movers from decarbonization and enhancing the climate resilience. But we need to make sure that these gains are sufficiently large that we can use that to compensate those who will be worse off. And how to make that happen, I don't know. Last slide. I'm trying to connect these two perspectives, one about people, one about geography or places. The perspective on people is sort of bottom up, and the perspective from the geography is sort of top down, to understand how challenging to look at the heterogeneity across the whole country. To synthesize these two perspectives, there are shades of grey in sustainable travel. There is no uniform standard, no objective standard. We are more sustainable on some days, on some trips, compared to the others. I think the good news is that we all can make a change. We all can make a change to make our travel more sustainable. We need to acknowledge this variability in policy making. We try to target on emissions profiles rather than individuals or trips. If we want to focus on travel behavior change, we need to frame this against a wider sort of lifestyle change. And this means that we need to think beyond transport. So sustainable travel is not only the transport policy goal. This involves wider policy effort in terms of, for example, places at the workplace. So whether you can engage in flexible working, housing policy. So we need to have a more intersectoral approach to enable or facilitate this lifestyle change to achieve transport sustainability. And again, we face this classic challenge in regional development and policy: place-based versus people-based. So shall we focus on those high emitters, particularly the involuntary high emitters, or shall we focus on those places with very high level of emissions? Place-based versus place-blind. I guess place-based is more of a decentralized approach, and the place-blind is a more centralized approach. I don't think it's a binary. We need to combine both. Certain intervention will have to come from the top down, but I guess this is a new venue for debate, and the past experience from policies addressing regional inequalities can be of great help. So that's all from me. I would like to acknowledge our founders, and this is the research center, the research project I was talking earlier. It's called DARE. If you're interested, go have a look at the other works from the center. I do hope that this presentation can give you a fresh perspective to look at sustainable transport. And I do want you to rethink about the early question I asked you: are you a sustainable traveler? Thank you.
Thank you. you so much, Lee. What I suggest that we get some feedback from Luca. Maybe you have questions or discussion points, and then we open the discussion to the whole group.
So you want me to come up?
Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
that's nice.
Yes, thanks a lot. Of course, I'm reacting to this presentation. I haven't read your papers. I mean, there's a lot of sophisticated work, so please excuse me if I'm too naive.
No, Professor.
I definitely think it's really useful what you're trying to do to disentangle all those different profiles behind travel and different places, look together at places and profiles beyond travel. I think most people working on mobility will totally agree with you, and many others do, but let's have a discussion, you know, because at least some of us have been saying this for years, tried that for years, so we have to try and understand why are not we succeeding in making any significant change. So that's what the discussion should help us understand. But I do have to I want to go into that especially, but I do have to put in a little something about the emission part and high, low income. And of course, there are more things to sustainable travel than carbon emissions. But if we focus on carbon emission, I would say that it really is not useful to only focus on everyday travel. We know that certainly for people that do also have long distance business and holiday travel, by far the highest share of emission is not in the everyday. You can cycle the whole year, and one intercontinental flight annihilates all the. So I think that if we care about carbon emission, we should focus on yearly data, including business holiday travel, and then you'll see what we know from many other researchers. Then the 10% reaches 10%, it hits 50%, etc. Those kind of analysis. So that's I think one big problem if we only focus on everyday travel. And Amsterdam is a fantastic example. We cycle everywhere, but we fly also everywhere. So that's why I didn't raise my hand. I try not to fly, but I fly every once, and that's really enough to make me much worse with my family in the villages in Italy. They drive everywhere, but never fly. But anyway, that's maybe getting us a bit off track, but we should, I mean, if that's the problem, is emission, carbon emissions, we cannot ignore that. But I think that maybe the more interesting discussion, because it's where you started, because it's totally true that of all the sectors, transport is the one that has changed less in terms of becoming more sustainable. And I think you say also what the problem is, that more than other sectors, than agriculture, energy, industry, is incredibly entangled with our lifestyles and our business models. So it's not really, we need to change how we live and do business to change travel. And by now we know that there's no technological way out of it. I mean, it might help, but it's, so that's why, so there's incredible resistance from individuals and also for society at large to change that. I mean, and that's why people like John Hurry have been already many years ago talking about, they say, the system of automobility. It's not just traveling, it's everywhere, everything. More recently, it's a very good article by Giulio Mattioli and others called the political economy of car dependence, and it shows, I mean, it's a compass of things. It's infrastructure, it's the economy, it's the culture. So there is an incredible resistance to change. And yet we have to change. And that's a question that really we are all struggling with and trying to find answer to. So that's also what the question I would ask you is, as you seem to acknowledge that there is this resistance to change, both at the individual, societal level, how to change travel behavior in any significant way based on the kind of findings that you are showing us. What have you learned about how we could change travel behavior in the face of this resistance? How to change these profiles, or how to change behavior which is so rooted in how a place is built, which cannot be changed from one day to the other. I mean, what does your research learn about how to change in the face of systemic resistance to change?
Can I?
Please,
Can
yes.
I get back? Okay. Yeah. So first of all, on your first comment, holiday trips, long distance trips, including the travel by air, within that week are included. But I do acknowledge that it's a very, very short observation period. That is the limitation of the data. If we, like in Germany, we do have monthly or yearly long travel diary data, then we can definitely expand that. But the holiday trips within that week are included here. On second point, which is much more fundamental, I completely agree with you, particularly you mentioned about this political economy of car dependence. And if we look at the correlation between mobility, basically total distance traveled either by passengers or by freight, and the GDP growth, you see a very, very strong positive correlation. So no wonder that why all governments want, the first thing they want to do after the pandemic is to open up, allow people to travel. So, and economists actually have this argument, is that it's because if you allow people to travel, allowing higher mobility, hence higher productivity, higher economic outcome. So I understand that for politicians, if you want to curb mobility, you basically, there will be a negative impact on the economic growth. But to answer your question, that can we actually do something about it? I don't believe technology would help too much. Because if you look at the current technological innovations in the transport sector, the very majority somehow make the travel cost cheaper. The car use is already underpriced. So again, I think the reason why we have all the problem is that the car travel is already underpriced. But if all the technological innovations been focusing on making travel even cheaper, people just travel more, having even more negative externalities. So what I would answer to you is that can we make the perceived costs of travel slightly higher? I want to highlight the perceived costs, not the actual costs, because whenever you increase the monetary cost of travel, politicians will fight back. But the perceived cost of travel. This can be changing the way that the city provides parking, making other modes more friendly, more culturally acceptable, relying on the new generation. We do observe that young professionals in London, they still own the car, but they don't necessarily use the car. So we don't undermine car ownership, but we encourage people, or actually providing the disincentives, say don't use your car on weekdays. So I think if we can focus on the perceived cost of travel, particularly those motorized modes, that can be a start. But I don't think technology innovation at the moment is helping with that.
I have a little point to add, and then I think I would like to turn to the audience, because this makes me think, this is not really my field, transport, but of course I'm a user too. Now, talking about travel behavior, can we change the behavior of people on transport, on mobility, based on their own choices, without providing alternatives to them. Because sometimes I think that when we think about the choices people have, Ori made a good point. He said it may not be a choice. You may get a sickness, it's not a choice, but transport is your choice. But in some contexts, and of course I'm thinking about contexts like Buenos Aires in Argentina, or Istanbul in Turkey, or Bogota, there are no choices as such of thinking of sustainable transport. You cannot cycle, while you can, but if somebody doesn't offer you the infrastructure, you won't be able to do that. So my question is, can we think of travel behavior change without governing what has to be done for the choices people have? So can policy follow people, or people follow policy? I think it's a reflection to you both from my side, but then I'll give the floor to the group. But I expect you to say something.
Yeah, you want to start?
That's a very difficult question. First, I want to touch on the choice thing. You mentioned that travel is a choice, but getting disease is not choice. But this is why I mentioned about this voluntariness framework, because for some people, traveling by car is not a choice. It's not a choice. They have to drive. For example, if you have 2 jobs in one day, no public transport will allow this level of mobility, then you have to choose. And there's another analogy between travel choices or travel behavior and the clinical science is about the exposure. The exposure is that, well, in clinical science is that, for example, you stay very close to a person with flu or other hazards, then this will increase your risk of getting that disease. But for travel, I think as well, if you live in the neighborhoods that everyone drives, then this will increase the probability that you will drive as well. So this cultural influence, neighborhood effects, I think is a very similar type of exposure that's in clinical science. So I think there is a comparability there. But getting back to your question, Tuna, the very reason why we have this issue is because of the negative externalities of travel. The externalities rise is because everyone make their own decisions in terms of where to live, how they travel, without considering the impact on other people. So that's the fundamental cause of these externalities. Because when I choose to drive, I don't consider the impact on other people. So I don't think offering more options will address this root cause. Because yes, you do have more options in terms of how you travel, but as long as you don't internalize, sorry, I use this economist terminology, as long as you don't internalize that cost, that unpaid costs, either for other people or for the environment, it won't change.
But cases like Bogota, like New York, people start using metro and underground more than public transport because the option was given to them. Don't you see this?
Yes, I think depends on the timing of that invention. I mean, if for example, in Bogota, the BRT turns out to be actually very viable compared with the car use because of the traffic jam. Now they realize that if they take the bus, actually it will be time saving in fact. Of course, people will switch to public transport. But if people have not reached that tipping point, say that I can't really drive anymore, you just offering more options. I don't think it might help, but I don't think that's the most effective way.
Sorry for my ignorance. This was more like my curiosity in the field.
No, but the dilemma is this: that people make choices based on an individual choice process that might not be beneficial for the collective. That's the basic dilemma, not only in this field, but to follow you, certainly we make choices in the context of options that we have or we think we have, because there's also these things. It's both objective and subjective, and there is a lot of, in mobility there's a lot of subjective which doesn't match with the objective, so that's to complicate things. But it's definitely not enough to create options. You need also to give incentives. Again, there's a whole literature, but to say it very simply, it has to be both sticks and carrots. And certainly to get people changed from something that is maybe highly valuable, also for psychological reasons, social reasons, or is habit. You also need these incentives. It's not enough, bike lanes, public transport. You also need to take up parking spaces. You need to make car use more expensive, and of course you need a whole political process that legitimizes these choices because it's better for the collective. So it's a very political struggle. But it's definitely not only positive incentives, also negative. You have to discourage one, encourage the other. And there are enough examples of big changes. That Ghent is a city in a few years dramatically reduced car use, increased bike use by a combination of definitely shifting much improving condition for biking and much worsening condition for driving at the same time, copying what Groningen already did 50 years ago.
Yes.
And with the same effect, so you can change.
Okay. Thank you. I think, we have first Anna and then Irene.
Thank you, because I wanted to follow up exactly on this discussion and on the idea of giving more choices and more alternatives. I think the problem is that so-called top emitters, to use your terminology, they already actually have a lot of choices. People who emit most have plenty of choices. They, if we look at people who fly for business 5-10 times per month, they have lots of options. They have a car or maybe even 2 cars in different cities. They can use public transport. They can drive. People do. So I would say we cannot, to the degree to which people are free in their mobility varies dramatically. So, and the problem is that many policy measures, sustainable mobility policy measures, digital innovation, shared solutions, and so forth, improve the mobility of people who already have a lot of choices and who actually already have a high level of accessibility. So we just improve the mobility and accessibility for people who already have it rather well, without making a significant dent in improving accessibility of people who struggle and for people who have very few options. So that, I think, speaking of carrots and sticks, for some segments of the population, some sticks are really good, but it's a very unpopular opinion politically, especially if we are looking at this side part of Europe and the governments, the color of the governments that we have, that is unspeakable. But this is where I think the solution is. And I just, in general, I really like both of your responses on how, I think this is, to me personally, this is the crux of the problem, that mobility choices and residential choices and mobility choices, especially of people who do have options, they are not made with regard for the collective or the consequences. This is the driving idea, sorry to promote my own work here, but this is the driving idea behind the concept of mobility as a commons. Which I developed, that we do exactly the problem that we see, that mobility is seen, especially by liberal governments, by neoliberal governments, as an individual right, rather than a commons to be collectively kind of managed, etc. So that's the key issue in my opinion.
Anna, do you mind introducing yourself? And I would ask everybody to do so because Lee doesn't know who we are. Yeah.
My name is Anna Nikolaeva. I'm assistant professor here working on mobility. Yeah, thank you very much for your work.
I think I saw a hand over there and then Irene. Yeah.
I had a question related to, because
Introduce yourself.
I'm Irene Gomez. I'm a postdoctoral researcher, also working on mobility. So I was wondering if you consider in the analysis to include, for example, when defining or when trying to understand the relationship between lifestyle and carbon footprint, some variables related to the characteristics of people, but not only related to their job, but also related, like, for example, if they have a caring responsibility, they have kids or not, because this is for me what is defining the lifestyle you have, probably in the same level or even more than your work, because sometimes your work depends also on if you have a caring responsibility or not. So I think this variable to reach a lot the
Yes. So.
complexity.
So we do consider those factors, and actually those are very important covariates that we need to control in identifying the lifestyles. Yeah. But we find this sort of retrospectively. So first we identify these latent groups, and then we find out, then we look at actually the profile of each group. Then we find out, for example, for people who belong to this particular emissions profile, there are lots of, for example, single parents, mom, with caring duties, and then we realize, oh, okay, so these are the factors that actually potentially lead to the higher propensity of choosing this lifestyle. Then we add this as a covariance, so that the model can actually capture this. So it's an iterative process, but we do control for the nature of your job, whether you have caring responsibilities, and what else? Have you recently moved home? So because we understand that if you move the house very recently, you're in a transitional period, so your lifestyle may look very differently. So yes, iteratively we identify these covariates and we act on them.
Alberto?
Many thanks for the lecture, was quite inspiring. My name is Alberto Rotti, I'm a PhD from Polytechnic University of Milan. And building on the point that made Tuna on the places that matter, I was wondering, I mean, you analyzed the UK case, right? And mostly I assume the London case. So thinking of rich people leaving the city center, basically, or in the core city of London and working there or working remotely. But what if we think on the cities with big sprawl, in which we're supposed to have like villas in the peripheral part, and think on, for instance, if we think about LA or Brussels also in Europe, in which have all these big villas and rich people moving to the city center and so using the car. Do you think, like in that case, the British case would be generalizable again? I mean, also comparing other. Thank you.
That's a good question, thank you. So, all the findings I present is UK specific, it's context specific. So this is based on the empirical evidence from England. But I think, yes, we probably can't generalize this to say that the higher socioeconomic groups in the United States are accessible as those that their counterpart in the Europe. I think we probably cannot generalize that too much, but the same method can apply there. We probably will have very different findings. Yeah, so this has to be done in a case-sensitive way, I think.
Elisha,
Hi, my name is Elisha Aaron. I'm a research master's student who's supervised by Tuna. Thank you for this. I'm wondering if you have some broader theoretical or philosophical even reflections on what this means for, the late capitalist world we're in. Like you mentioned, GDP rises, movement rises, right? And not only that, I think the identification of the emissions profiles between those who involuntarily, because of whatever life circumstances they're in, have to day to day use more emissions versus those who are doing so because they have the economic means to travel wherever they want to. I'm curious if you have broader reflections on what this means for the state of, or let me say it differently. This has very interesting implications for involving power and inequality in the world. The involuntary missions seems like something that's about infrastructural inequalities, whereas the voluntary missions is about power. So I'm curious if you have any reflections on not only how policy might address those issues, but also what that means in terms of what the world would look like if we didn't have those inequalities and power differentials in terms of travel.
That's a fascinating question. I'm afraid that's a whole new dimension I haven't thought about in this project. But I do acknowledge that voluntary high emissions is a reflection of power, and involuntary high emission perhaps is a constraint, is a choice constraint. Probably something to do with the capitalism. But we also observe involuntary low emissions, in the sense that if we can provide faster mode of travel, these people will travel a bit more, leading to a welfare gain, or maybe even a productivity gain, and empower them a bit more. So I don't think mobility is the enemy of that, to all cases. Mobility can be a powerful tool of enabling or empowering people, but of course, again, we can't generalize that for the whole population, so because we also observe cases that, for example, if this lady would have better access to public transport, it may lead to better life outcomes. But so I guess this can go either way, but really depends on which segment that we talk about. So that's my reflection. Answer to your question.
Because there's something that came into my head as well, is that, I mean, the high emitters on a weekly basis, like Luca, you mentioned, you go back to Italy and that ruins your travel for the year, right? And as someone who's from the United States, I visit my family. Again, I had the means and ability to come study in Amsterdam, but I go visit my family and I'm the problem, right? And so what's interesting here is almost like, and I hate to say this, but it's almost like there's the nativist course in fighting capitalism, don't leave, stay where you're from. And in some ways, this very progressive value, right? There's very progressive value of diversity in the world and valuing people, right? Is it? This is just another reflection that came into my head of something about this is interestingly, it's.
But the very fact that you are here raising this question, it generates a social value. And should we include that social value into this whole
Was it worth the carbon emissions for me to raise this question here?
You're raising the public awareness of this. So I guess if you only, this is what Luca mentioned, is that if we only look at carbon emissions, greenhouse emissions, this is just one of the many measurements and can be actually quite partial. Sometimes we need to think about the benefits of having those emissions, right? Not only to the economy, but also to the whole society. Like me being able to visit Amsterdam, I was in Vienna last week learning about social housing. So I said, if mobility allows me to generate social values, should we actually offset that carbon cost or environmental cost? So I think this is the wider way that how we measure, how we measure impact, how we measure costs.
I just want to say, because I think that's very interesting and important what you said. But I want to connect it to what Anna was saying about commoning. Because I say commoning is that it's not your problem, it's our problem, so that we becoming aware of the limits and then decide to use the space within the limits, which might include distance travel with a purpose, not only for you, but for us. I mean, we don't want to stay each in our island, but it's a discussion that we should have, it's a political discussion that we should have with each other. And the key point of commoning, as opposed to let the market decide, is not that who, as the means, decides and the others adapt. Is that it is a discussion in which your right and my right are just as equal, and we have a discussion, but your family lives somewhere else, my family here, I might say you have a right to visit them. I mean, it's just a stupid example, but probably we need more, we'll have to have more and more of this discussion. I don't know if that's, it's what you...
Yes, I think that's the nature of commoning, that you together you discuss what our goals of the community, what are our values, and what are the means to support those values moving forward. But that's not how mobility policy is decided upon. And unfortunately, with the sort of political landscape we're in, I see very little prospect for that negotiation at least taking place on a national level, but rather sort of in grassroots way. But national and international levels are very difficult right now for that kind of conversation.
We had two more questions, Jake, and then I think, yeah.
Jake, yes. Do you see some relation between involuntary car use and low income? Didn't you study it? Because that's the most problematic group. They have no choice and they have no means.
Involuntary car use or involuntary car users are not necessarily low-income people. We observe, particularly in the case of London, we observe those, for example, mom with child caring duties, they have to drive. They actually have a very well-paid job, but they are able to work, for example, part-time or remotely. So we don't see a direct link between income and this involuntary car use. And actually, we can only infer this voluntariness because there's no data in our national travel survey to indicate this level of voluntariness.
You saw perhaps a correlation between variability and involuntary car use.
Yes.
Something.
Yes.
Variability was again low in the whole high income. So
I can only share my hypothesis with you. Like I said, this is work in progress. So we think that high availability is lower voluntariness and potentially higher adaptability. Adaptability means that they are probably more sensitive to policy interventions than those with very, very low variability. So high variability, low voluntariness, and high adaptability. So that's our working hypothesis at the moment.
Okay.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I'm Bram from Wanning, a junior lecturer at the department. And I noticed you sort of plotted the increase and decrease in car usage against public transport.
By distance, the change is less than 1%. So it's around between 0.1 to about 0.9%. This is measured by distance, not by number of trips, but by distance traveled.
Yeah, but that's what we want. I mean, it's that, again, why is distance important? I mean, from a sustainability point of view, we want people to travel shorter distances because that's more sustainable, from a sustainability point of view. And of course, traveling by bike or walking is lower, so we have fixed time budget, so we travel less further. But the whole idea is if you can create environments already of the 15-minute cities that you don't need to travel far to have a good life, that's good. So I would say that then we should look at number of trips or time spent traveling. No, this distance is like a bias that the more distant you travel, the better it is. These are very, okay, if mobility, the growth of mobility is the goal, the growth of economic goal, okay, distance. But if we want, how can we make a good life in a sustainable way, then trips and should be the measure, number of trips or time spent traveling, not distance.
I think both measurements are important. I completely agree from a welfare perspective. Number of trips perhaps makes more sense because you don't actually ration yourself in terms of how much distance you travel every week, but you probably will control, for example, how much time I allocate for traveling on a daily or weekly basis, because you're busy, you have other commitments. But why this distance also matters is because distance is a much better measurement in terms of environmental costs. Because it's the distance traveled combined with the mode that you use, we can estimate the environmental cost of that. It's not by the number of trips, but actually the distance traveled. This is why commuting and leisure, you mentioned exactly, the holiday trips by aeroplane, is one trip. Or cycling for 10 minutes is also one trip, but the environmental costs actually vary between these two significantly. So it would be better if we use those measurements rather than just one.
Okay. Other questions or reflections? I think we had a variety of interesting responses. I'm still going back home thinking, thank you so much, first of all, Lee, for this wonderful lecture. And for instigating this discussion. I'm going home with this feeling of thinking of the variety of scales and conditions of cities. Because I think, when you think of a city like Istanbul, I mean, being a big city like London, but on top of that, you have political layer, you have informality, you have all kinds of other layers of complexities. You were referring to wicked problems. I think we need to really think about more variety of solutions and policy approaches to transport issues. But thanks so much for letting us think on this direction.